Good afternoon, everybody. I think we've just started the webinar, so I'm going to wait a few moments for people to join. But I'm not going to wait too long because we've got a load of great panelists to hear from today. So, wow, numbers have ticked up. So I am going to start and say hello. So welcome, everybody, today to Regen's webinar on the barriers to community energy. Thank you very much for joining us. I'm Poppy Maltby. I'm the head of local energy at Regen. I'm going to be chairing the session today. If we go quickly to the first slide, thanks, Sabrina. For those that don't know us, and hopefully lots of you do, we're a not-for-profit centre of energy expertise, and we have a mission to transform the energy system for a net zero future. But as an organisation, we really recognise that people and communities are going to be really critical to that transformation. We're moving from this centralised energy system to a decentralized one, and to do that at the scale and pace that we need to, we really need to bring people along on that journey. So that means having a transition that benefits local areas and communities, not just companies and energy businesses, which is why community energy is something that we are really keen as an organisation to champion and have done for many years. We're also a membership organisation, thanks Brina. So for those who would support us in our mission, there are various options to become members, which you can see here. So do get in touch if that is of interest. But now on to the session. So it's worth quickly covering, I guess, the objectives of the session today. We're holding this in response to the Barriers for Community Energy Call for Evidence that was launched by DESNZ in April. And it has responses due by the 30th of June. It's still there. I checked today. So I'm hoping that call for evidences are immune to general election PERDA rules, but do let me know if I'm wrong about that. But I expected it would have been taken down by now. But even if the administration changes, we think it's a really valuable opportunity to get a weight of evidence into government and DESNZ about all the things that can be done by an enthusiastic new administration to bring the benefits of the energy transition to people. So the objective of today is to help Regen sort of refine our thoughts and gather evidence for our consultation response, but we're also hoping this is going to be really useful for other organisations with an interest in this sector to put together their own responses. So we'll be sharing all the slides today, and we'll be sharing a recording so you can watch back and take some notes. And we're hoping also to share our consultation response ahead of the close, so people can take from it what they wish. So on to the actual agenda. We're going to be having sort of two sections today. Firstly, hearing from my colleague Prina on some of Regen's sort of initial thoughts on the key areas for the consultation. We're going to be using Menti for that session to get some of your feedback and comments. So do have another screen ready for that if you can. It's going to be followed by a panel session where we're going to be exploring in particular one of the solutions around shared ownership. And we want to do that in a bit more depth and detail, including what could or should the policy agenda be around that. And so we're really pleased to have such great panelists today who are all extremely knowledgeable in this area. We've got Rebecca from Lancaster University, Jake from Communities for Renewables, Monika from Thrive, and Paul from Energy for All. So thanks to them for joining us today. So we're in a Zoom webinar. So I think that means you can't interact directly with us, but we do have two Zoom functions that you can talk to us through. The first is the chat function. So please use that to say hi, to share your thoughts and have conversations. And then there's the separate Q&A function where you can raise, I guess, official questions for the panel. So you can put your question in and who you would like to pose that to. You can upvote these, I think. So if you could do that, then we can pick the top ones. Prina is going to be reviewing some of those during the discussion, and so we should hopefully get answers to some of your questions in the discussion session. So I think that's all I needed to cover, and so I will hand over to Prina.
Brilliant, thank you, Poppy. So firstly, I am just going to kind of give an overview on what this call for evidence is. So last year, the government committed to consult on the barriers to community energy, and this was created in coordination with the community contact group. And there are 9 questions within this. It includes the barriers, the solutions, the impacts, and how it's going to support the wider targets that the government has. But in this particular webinar, in my presentation, we're going to be focusing on the barriers and, more importantly, the solutions as well, and how we can go forward with that. Just to note, it says that it's only for England, this consultation. However, we recognise that a lot of these issues transcend borders and do impact Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland as well. And so a lot of our solutions are based around changes that are wider than just England as well. And we do encourage communities and authorities and everyone to respond from all over the UK. So, as Poppy said, we're going to be using Menti to try and get some of your feedback, which is really important to us. It's just to get us started on Menti. You can do this on a different tab or on your phone. You can use the QR code that's appeared just then. So if you go to www.menti.com and use the code 58036040, hopefully you'll be taken to this first question. And this is just to get an idea of who's in the room. So it'd be really interesting to understand what type of organisation you're from. That's great, we're getting a few through. Quite a even split at the moment. That's great. So one of the things, it's really great to see both local authorities, support organisations, consultants and community energy all in the room, because we know that those collaborations are going to be vital now, as they are now, but also in the future. So yeah, that's great. I'll just give it maybe 10, 20 more seconds just so that everyone's able to get on. Great, well, thank you all so much for coming. I'm just going to move on. You can still carry on logging into Menti while we go to this one and give your feedback in the next questions as well. So firstly, what are the barriers to community energy? And we've got this really helpful pie chart from the state of the sector, which was done by Community Energy England, Scotland and Wales. And on the left, I've picked out a few of them, which we're going to be focusing on in this presentation. It's by no means all of the barriers that community energy faces. So firstly, just in terms of the generation specific, so particularly for solar, wind, hydro, it's the lack of viable business models for small to medium scale generation. It's really difficult at the moment to get the business models to stack up. A part of that is the next bullet point along, which is the grid connection aspect of it. We're seeing from our members and other people that we're engaging, the cost, especially in areas of high constraints where you're paying for the upgrades, can be quite high. And because of the transmission constraints as well, we're seeing that the length of time to connect can be up to 10 years, which is obviously really makes a project really difficult to do. Another thing that has been coming up is navigating the planning system, and I'll be going into this a little bit more a little bit later. And then we have the more kind of general barriers, which include barriers for groups doing energy efficiency and retrofit work, which is the early stage funding. So that can include feasibility or at-risk capital funding, but also the pre-project stage funding as well. And that kind of leads to, it's a highly volunteer-led sector. I think it's around 70% volunteers, the community energy sector. So time, capacity, limited expertise are all barriers at the moment. So now let's move on to the potential solutions. The first one that we just mentioned was the time capacity and limited expertise. And so a couple of ways that we could support the sector is in pre-project funding. So this is to build capacity and pay community energy volunteers to develop their skills and projects. So this might be before they've even created a project, but it's to give the time and ability to do that. And the other thing is about making sure that knowledge can be shared and the expertise that's needed given as well. So giving access to individuals and organisations with the skills and knowledge. And an example of this is the development officers in Scotland. So currently there's 8 regional local development officers which support community groups with their projects. Regen did a bit of research last year which highlighted that even these aren't seen by some stakeholders as granular enough to build meaningful local capacity. So in that we recommended to employ a more granular spatial level, for example, at local authority level. So that's just one kind of example of a potential solution as well. So this is where we really love your feedback. What specifically would community energy need any funded time and capacity for? So we're asking in terms, and this is a written question, so you can just kind of type your answers in. Would that be to develop projects? Would it be to hire a consultant for a feasibility study? What would that funded time and capacity and those people, what would they be doing? What would you find useful? And so it'd be great to get a couple of responses on that. Yeah, that's really a planning, being able to take part in local planning. Energy planning is a really important part of that. Great, yeah, the knowledge aspect of it, being able to access the legal, how to develop a project, technical expertise, that's really important. Yeah. So a lot of this is around kind of navigating how to do a project as well. Great, I'm going to give it 5 more seconds, and then the next slide I'm going to ask you to look at what other people have written and vote on what you agree with, which will hopefully kind of, yeah. Brilliant, thank you. So here, hopefully you can vote on what other people have written. So uptick what you agree with. I can't actually see what's going on here, but I'm assuming that there's something on everyone's screens. Okay, I'm gonna move on from that one. So yeah, thank you for your feedback on that. We're going to take that back and include, like Poppy said, include a lot of this within our response and use it to proceed. So the next big barrier is the lack of profitable business models. And we've proposed 2 solutions here from the 2 angles. Firstly is price support, so securing a fixed price for any generated electricity over a longer period of time to give projects that certainty that is going to be an income at a level that makes it viable. So on the right, I've given an example here of the renewable energy support in Ireland. So it's based on the contracts for different scheme here. But in the second auction round there, they included a separate category called the community preference category. And they had to demonstrate that any project going into this was 100% community owned. And in the end, there were 9 community energy projects that benefited from this. They've actually removed that for the next round this year and had that's a competitive process. So they've created a separate non-competitive small scale generation scheme process. So that will be interesting to see whether or not that's more appropriate for community energy schemes. But that's an example of a fixed price mechanism. The other aspect of it is to reduce the cost of the project. So an example could be low cost borrowing. So having access to low or no interest loans or grants, and potentially with a grant de-risking that loan as well. So the next question I'm then going to ask is, where do you think the kind of priority should be for us in advocating for this? Do you think we should be more as a scale? So you, on the right hand side, we've got a higher price, focusing on getting a higher price for electricity, and having that fixed price for a long period. Or on the left, we have reducing that cost of the project, and having the low interest loans or other mechanisms that reduce the cost. And it's very likely that this might be an in-between thing. We would just need a bit of both as well. Great, I think that might have been everyone who's voted, so thank you. So okay, so we're kind of in the middle, but leaning towards the reduced cost of project. Okay, I've been told by Hannah to slow down. I'm going a little bit too quickly and not allowing enough time. Apologies. Okay. Great. Thank you. So grid connections are a massive issue at the moment in the any renewable development, not just community energy. And this is something that Regen has been working on. We've recently put out a thought piece on the local grid, and we've also got a working group who discuss these issues within our members. In terms of more community energy specific, the ESO and Ofgem are talking about how to change the queue at the moment. So shifting it from a first come, first served, which is what it is currently, to a more controlled access where you have to meet certain milestones to be able to carry on and stay in the queue. And as part of the longer term changes, we're advocating for social value, so including community ownership to be included as one of the preference criteria within that queue connection. And so this is not necessarily saying that it will put you higher up in the queue, but that it has some weighting. Similarly, the planning system and navigating the planning system is something that is a wider renewable development issue at the moment. And we've put out another thought piece very recently on local planning for renewables and the policy challenges and our recommendations around that. One of the key ones in regard to community energy is that we believe that the national planning policy should include community energy as a material consideration. So that means that it's able to be looked at, community energy when an application comes in, whether or not it has a community ownership angle is something that is considered and whether that gets a planning application. The other thing, and this is one of the, in the pie chart at the beginning, we saw that the complexities of the planning system are often challenging for community energy organisations. So we are suggesting that local authorities could provide a free pre-application service to support community projects going through that process. At the moment, this is given at a few councils around the country, but it's not consistent. As always, and as we outline in the paper, this all needs to be funded. Councils need to be well resourced, but that is another one of our recommendations. So this is my last Menti for you. We are going to need big developments to get to our net zero goals, and they're already being developed across the country. So 50 megawatts, bigger projects, offshore projects. And we want to make sure that local benefit is retained by local communities from those projects. So I've given a few options here about how that could be done. So one example of that is shared ownership. We could have community benefit funds where money from the development is given to the local communities to be done with what they wish. We could just have the wider economic benefits of those developments. So that would include jobs, that would include the tax that they pay, that would also include, they've all moved around now, include the infrastructure that would be built, roads, etc. Public ownership, for example, Labour's proposal for a GB Energy, that's another option. Energy bill discounts for local communities, and the last one, which was just buying shares in the development company. Let's give you a few seconds to rank those. I know this is quite difficult, and I'm sure many of you would say, well, actually, we need more than one of these things, and I would totally agree. But this is just to get us an idea of what we think the priorities around how to get benefit from local development is. I'm glad that shared ownership is high up on that list, because that is obviously what we're going to be talking about later and getting into a little bit more detail. So that's great to see. Still moving around a little, so I'll just give it a couple more seconds. Great, thank you. So that's just last to say, please do get in touch if you have any thoughts on what I've said today, or any other kind of evidence or things that you think we should be including in our consultation response or advocating for in the future. And we really, really value having this engagement and making sure that we're touching on the right things. So yeah, thank you very much for listening, and I'm going to pass back over to Poppy for the panel session.
Lovely, thank you, Prina. Just highlights, I think, how there are so many things that can be done to support the sector, so that's always nice to see. I can see myself now, but I'm hoping to quite soon see also some of our panelists. Oh, fantastic. So we're going to go to our panelists now, and as Prina said, the sort of second part of this session is going to be exploring a little bit more the whys and wherefores of shared ownership as a solution. So I'm going to go around the panel now and ask them to introduce themselves a bit and give us a sort of 101 on shared ownership from their perspective. So I'm going to go first to Rebecca Willis from Lancaster University. If you could give us a bit more of a sort of background of what we mean when we're talking about this.
Thanks, Poppy. Great to be here, and thank you so much for focusing on this. It's an issue close to my own heart for reasons which I will explain. So, I mean, I think very fundamentally shared ownership means giving local communities a meaningful stake in developments near them. It's different from community benefit, which is just essentially a payment which the developer remains in control of. I think the two things which make it stand out is firstly that it is an ownership stake, that there's a sort of economic aspect to this, that it is actually about ownership, and secondly that there's an element of control for the community. And why would you do that? Well, my research looks at how people, government and business engage with each other around climate, and it's clear that although renewables are very popular, and polling shows that, where to the extent that people are concerned, it's often because they see what they see as large untrustworthy energy companies doing stuff near them, and they don't have any control over it, and that's why you get this antagonistic planning system. And so shared ownership just puts the community back in control a bit more. But I think more widely, I'm always in search of what I call sort of symbolic policies, which are energy and climate policies, which sort of articulate a wider vision about how we want to tackle climate and move to net zero. And shared ownership strikes me as one of those, one of those policies which really which really gives you a picture of how people and business and government can work together on the climate challenge. So we can come back to some of those points, but that's very outline sort of what it is and why you might do it. And coming to the history, I mean, this is kind of good and bad. So about 10 years ago now, under the coalition government, and this was mainly driven by Ed Davey, there was an initiative by Ed Davey, which said that developers should be obliged to offer a share in ownership of renewables developments, onshore renewables developments, to local communities over a certain threshold. I think it was £2.5 million, so sort of medium upward sized developments. And that was going to be done on a voluntary basis to start with. And I was very involved in the discussions between the community sector and the developers about how that could work. And they were difficult negotiations for reasons I can go into, but essentially a shared vision emerged for how communities could be offered shared ownership, and that all developers should be expected to do that. And at the time, there was even a move to make it mandatory if it didn't happen through a voluntary route. So it was quite a strong expectation. That all fell apart with the 2015 election. It was a sort of victim of circumstance, but it has, it's never been disproven as a good idea, basically. So it's sort of been sitting in the wings. We haven't had much onshore wind development since then in England, so it's been untested from that point of view as well. But I still sort of hold firm to my core belief that it would be an incredibly an incredibly useful and effective approach.
Lovely, thanks, Rebecca. I'm going to go over to Paul now, who's been one of the organisations that's been championing this. And yeah, if you could introduce yourself a little bit about what you've done in Energy for All, Paul, and yeah, some of the details about what this is.
Okay, thank you. So yes, my name's Paul Phare, and I work for Energy for All, but I've been in the community energy sector now for about 20 years, starting in Scotland, and I've been working with Energy for All since about 2009. Now, Energy for All, if you like, pioneered shared ownership in the UK. Bay Wind, which Energy for All came out of, was the first community-owned wind farm in the UK. And after their initial project, they went on to develop Harlock Hill, which was a split ownership project where certain turbines were owned by the community and some by the developer. Energy for All also worked with EDF on another split ownership project in another part of the country. I forget the name of it now. And since then, Energy for All has worked with, they're called Lancaster now, but they were Phare Renewables, and that was on a revenue share model. So, and that's a model that has been adopted by pretty much every Phare project that's been onshore wind projects been developed in the UK. So, out of these experiences came three quite distinct shared ownership models. So, as I was mentioning there, the split ownership model is where the community own a number of assets, and the developer would own a number of assets. So there's a split there in ownership. That can be done on wind farms, for instance, a number of wind turbines. On solar farms, it could be a solar farm, not so easy on hydro. But that means that the community has full ownership of the asset. They have full control over all the contracts in that model. Now, another model emerged, which was the joint venture. And anyone who's familiar with joint ventures with companies, it's simply two SPV or an SPV, which the community and the developer have shares in. Slightly more complicated, especially where debt gets involved in that, which I won't go into now. But this can be sometimes quite a challenging, financially quite a challenging model to make work. Energy for All has done that a number of times with our Highland Hydro project, where there is there's joint ownership between a developer and the community on several hydro schemes. The one that seems to be most popular with developers, and there's reasons for that, and that's the revenue share model. It's very flexible. It can be very locally focused. There's no sort of minimum amount that needs to be raised by the community to buy assets. However much they raise, you can buy that amount of share of revenue of the project. Where where it's slightly weaker than the other models, I think, is the ownership is there's no ownership of assets in a revenue share. You literally, it's a contract between the community and the company that gives the community a benefit of that share for a long period of time. I think developers like it because it's less complex. Many developers like to sell on their assets, having a separate party involved in that transaction could be considered complicated. So yeah, I mean, and also from the community's perspective, the revenue share could be of interest because it's very light touch. You don't have to get involved in the operations so much. You really are just sort of owning a financial stake in that project. So those three models have evolved over time. Developers, they see the benefit of engaging with communities. For them, it's going to mean, hopefully, if they've got a good relationship with the community, that will benefit them in the planning process, even though that's non-material. Certainly Phare saw a lot of value in engaging with the community and offering more than the standard community benefit package. The fact that local people could invest definitely engaged more people with the project, especially leading up to the planning. And then also the benefits beyond the project would be, when they were doing an extension to that wind farm, for instance, and then the community would benefit even more. The community were more supportive of that extension. So I think I'll leave it there for now, and yeah, I'll answer any questions in the panel session.
Lovely, thank you, Paul. I'm going to go over to Jake, and just noting that some comments made about that, why can't just communities own 100%? I mean, I think there will be projects where they own 100%, but perhaps you want to cover, Jake, some of the sort of, why is shared ownership a good thing for the communities and for the developers as well, from your perspective?
So I'll start by broadening the definition, which I think Paul had alluded to already. And let's use shared ownership to refer to any model really where a community buys parts of or all of a renewable energy generation development from a commercial developer. So I'm Jake, Director of Communities for Renewables. We're a community interest company that helps set up local energy enterprises and works with them to develop, finance and manage their own generation. We manage 50 megawatts of community-owned solar across 7 different localities, and 49 of that 50 megawatts is a form of shared ownership. They are projects which started life as commercial developments and were sold into local community ownership. And those projects range from 4 to 15 megawatts in scale. And they came about because under that coalition government, at the same time as the shared ownership strategy and the voluntary shared ownership model, Ed Davey also introduced a single line to the feed-in tariff, which gets called the split fit policy, which enabled so the feed-in tariff was always capped at 5 megawatts. And what the split fit policy enabled was a project larger than 5 megawatts. If part of it was community owned, if it was split into the first 5 megawatts, a developer could get a fit for. The developer could sell the rest of the project to a community entity, and that community entity could get a feed-in tariff. So that say we had a developer that had a 20 megawatt solar farm, they could only get a fit for 5, but they could sell the other 15 to a community entity, and they could get a fit for it. In 3 solar farms at 5, it's slightly complicated. Anyway, that policy's gone, but that it's gone because the fit has gone. But over 2 years, that single line in the feed-in tariff alone delivered a very significant percentage of the community-owned solar capacity that we have today. And it delivered it because it was a revenue support mechanism which was only open to communities. So I don't think the government sees local energy, community energy as a means of delivering megawatts. I don't think they ever have, and I think that's probably reasonable. They can deliver megawatts through offshore wind and big solar farms at big developers. what they see community energy, local energy, the benefit of community and local energy is a means to delivering the hard stuff, which requires trust, local knowledge, and such as retrofitting our housing stock and tackling fuel poverty. And a good way to do that is to have a trusted local energy enterprise in each locality. But those local energy enterprises, they need money to be properly resourced. And a good way of enabling those local energy enterprises to have money and resources is to support them to own generation at scale. The bulk of the UK's megawatts, our pipeline to 2030 is already tied up by commercial developers. It's already in there in planning pipelines, grid pipelines. So the only way that a significant percentage of our renewables will be locally owned is through some kind of shared ownership, split ownership policy that forces a percentage of that capacity into local ownership.
Lovely. Thank you, Jake. Some interesting things to ponder on there. And I'm going to go over to Monika now to introduce yourself from Thrive's perspective. Yeah, what's the developer's perspective? Are you seeing appetite for this in your sector?
Yes. Hi, everyone. I'm Monika Paplaczyk. I'm Investment Director at Thrive Renewables. For those that know us, we based in Bristol, and we've been funding projects for 30 years now. And we especially have a community energy project in our heart. We've done 20 million of investment in the last 5 years into community projects. And I think many of you are either on the panel or in the audience projects that we funded. So, for example, Meanmore, which is Energy for All, 6.9 megawatt project in Cumbria, Ambition Community Energy project in Bristol, owned by Lawrence Weston Community Group. So yeah, we've been funding projects, and it's a really interesting distinction that you've made. Jay, kind of what is a community energy shared ownership, and the 100% as well. That includes that, and I think those projects that I mentioned, for example, and some of those you've worked on, are great examples of how communities can deliver a project and work with developers, with commercial developers, to find the right models and to build on that, and scaling up that ambition. I think is great. I'm really excited that shared ownership is on the agenda now. In terms of appetite from developers' perspective, I think many developers up to now didn't think that's important, but I think that that's not niche anymore. I think that big group of developers realize, especially when they're going for bigger projects, that they do need community groups on board. Interestingly, I am at a Solar UK conference in London this week, and interestingly, out of all the panels which have been over the 2 days, every panel, people put questions up. Many of them are developers, are about how to bring communities together into projects that they are developing. So I think the time is really now. There's a momentum between developers and community groups, and it's about how to put it together. So really excited about the work you as Region do as well on that.
Lovely. Thank you, Monika. So we have a Q&A function. I've got loads of questions, so I don't need you to ask them necessarily, but it would be great to get some feedback from attendees as to what you would like to ask the panel, or questions you would like, or just issues you would like us to discuss. But I'm going to, I guess, move the discussion now into the sort of how do we get more of this happening across the country, and we've had some ideas of what that looks like. I guess the first question was that we've seen other countries do this in some format, including in Scotland and Wales. What have we learned from, what are they doing, and what have we learned from that, and what do you think we could start to replicate here? I don't know who's best to ask that to. I might go back to Rebecca if you've got anything to add?
I think one thing that's clear when you look across other countries is that it's much more ambiguous in other countries about what is, you know, there's much more there's much more sort of mixing up goes on between municipalities, private companies, non-profits, communities of various types. And essentially that means that bigger projects can have more community input of one type or another, whether that's through non-profits, through locally owned companies, or through municipalities. I think what we've got in this country, which is almost certainly a result of you know, a sort of very market-focused energy system, is you know, the dominance of big companies, and then communities feeling quite threatened by that. And so I think that's one of the reasons why, and I've seen it in the chat, people say, well, we want 100% community owned, and I totally get that. But as a lot of people on this in this meeting will attest to, it's really difficult for communities at the moment to do things at scale, especially if, you know, as Prina summarised, we're working with, you know, 70% volunteers. My own view is that there's a real need for the community energy sector to be professionalised, and I don't think that there's you know, I don't personally, I don't see that as problematic if it means it can scale up. You know, people should be paid for a job. In fact, there are some, I think there are some real sort of equal opportunities issues around not paying people actually. So I think what that means is that we would actually benefit from more blurring of those lines between the private sector and communities and municipalities. But that's actually quite hard for us to do under our system. And definitely when I did the shared ownership task force, I said that it wasn't easy. The reason that it wasn't easy is because the community representatives were quite rightly defensive of their patch, wanting to keep what's really good about communities, wanting to keep that kind of real, you know, bottom up non-profit sort of feel of things, and then developers sort of, you know, desperate to get projects that turn a profit and worried that, you know, messing about with communities would get in the way. I mean, that's a bit of a caricature, but that was basically the division. And although both sides could see that, you know, it would be in the long-term interest to cooperate, it wasn't in their short-term interest necessarily, and there was a lot of suspicion. So I think that the more we can do to get these groups sort of working together collaboratively, and that might mean, you know, picking off developers that are you know, more in tune with this and who more see the need to cooperate, I think the better, which doesn't mean for a second that there shouldn't be 100% owned community projects. There absolutely should, and anyone who can do that is an absolute hero and deserves all the support they can get.
Thanks, Rebecca. And I guess that's quite an interesting point as well, because we've got quite a lot of local authorities on the call, and you know, the role of the local authority potentially in these sorts of structures is an interesting one. Paul.
Yeah, so I can tell you a little bit about what happens in Scotland when I was working up there. So the Forest Estate, when it looked at developing wind on its land and hydro, which is obviously public land, they did put a mandatory. It went out to tender to the market, find developers to develop these projects. But as part of the tender, they had to share the project with the local community in some way, and that gave the option for the community to purchase up to a certain percentage of the wind farm or the hydro scheme. I can't exactly remember the percentage now. I think it was very high though. So yeah, so that really helped bring forth quite a few projects. I don't know actually how many are going ahead because I'm not working in Scotland anymore, but I believe that was the intention anyway. And you know, because Scotland does this thing very well. Everyone else followed. Wales has got something similar, I believe. Certainly working in the Republic of Ireland, Quilshire, who owns the estate there, they're also looking into sort of mandatory shared ownership.
Yeah, the mandatory versus voluntary is a really interesting question. Monica, your thoughts?
I just want to come with an example of project we have done at Thrive. So a project some of you might have seen is Phare Road, which is a battery storage in Bristol. And this project was, the site was initially planned to be developed as a diesel genset kind of model. And the local community around the project in central Bristol, we're not very happy. They didn't want to have coal and kind of other diesel kind of fumes, etc., going from the project to the local area. So what they've done is they said, we appreciate, we need to do we need to be doing clean energy, etc. So they opposed that original project, and they decided that they would welcome a battery storage project in their area. So and they were successful with the local authority, and they approached a local developer to develop battery storage, which took place, and a company called Aura Power developed that project. So and then when the project had planning and grid, Thrive Renewables acquired a project from Aura Power. And we carried on discussions with the local community, around the project construction, etc., and realized that there is a real appetite from the community energy to have some investment in the project as well. So Bristol Energy Cooperative and Thrive agreed that BEC can acquire an investment in a project post construction. And so they came in with an option to put up to 20% of project cost, invest in that, that sort of level. We've created a structure. It was very bespoke. It's not been a model that's been done before. So we kind of had to come up with a way how this can be done. And yeah, that's happened. And it's great to have that kind of local knowledge and that, and BEC and other groups in Bristol were a big part of that project. So it definitely is a model, I think, that can be replicated on all renewables, and probably refined as well, how we've done it. But yeah,
I think it would be useful, I guess, to get some thoughts on this sort of mandatory versus voluntary requirement. I mean, that's the strongest, I guess, policy that could be put out there. You were mentioning there, Monica, that actually what happened was that they would buy that after construction, which obviously makes things easier. But then does that still tick the box for shared ownership to get you
well, that's
approvals and things? So that's quite an interesting question. I don't know, Jake, do you have thoughts on the mandatory versus voluntary approach to, I guess, just telling developers they need to have shared ownership?
So I think whether it's mandatory or not, in my view, is it should be, it has to be backed up by wraparound policies which make it viable and attractive for both developers and communities. I think just a signal that we would like developers and communities to engage in shared ownership discussions didn't lead anywhere under the shared ownership task force, and it isn't going to lead anywhere now. We need a set of policies that make this a worthwhile thing to do on both sides, and that could be with strong signals in planning, some kind of right to buy, a revenue support mechanism which is only available to communities, whether that's a community CFD or a FIT, some kind of local supply model. Communities need access to finance through some kind of revolving loan fund, and there could be grid benefits, whether that's points in a grid queue, that if you've got community ownership that pushes you up a queue, or whether communities have a right to connect and a certain percentage of capacity is ring fenced for communities. You need all of that in place to make this work. And on top of that, you need some kind of mechanism which sets the price at which a share of a project is transferred to a community, or all of a project is transferred to a community, because there is no point a community buying some or all of a wind farm or solar farm if the price they pay means the project is so overcapitalized that all it's doing is servicing its operating and finance costs. The whole point of doing this is to get assets into community ownership which are profitable and generate surplus income to support that community's net zero transition. So the price needs to be sufficiently low that it's worthwhile for communities, but developers also need to get their capital back plus a reasonable profit on the risk and construction capital that they put in. And we also need some kind of very robust definition of what community ownership means. That hasn't been very well defined in the past. And under the split fit policy, there was a bunch of capacity that went into nominal community ownership, i.e. solar farms owned by a qualifying company, but that qualifying company has no relation to the local community, hasn't done anything for the local community because it's been sold to a Swedish pension fund. So I would say, yes, headline, it should be mandatory, but around that, you need a load of supporting policies to make it worthwhile for both sides.
That's great. Thanks, Jake. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, 100% agree with everything Jake said there. And Energy for All has been involved in this for such a long time. We've probably met every single developer out there. They've all been interested in our model. They all like the idea of shared ownership, but I think when it comes down to it, when they actually realize they have to give something of value away, and because they don't have to, they don't. They just walk away, especially when it gets to the finance director. So yeah, it needs to be made mandatory, and I honestly believe as well that it needs to be focused on the early pre-planning stages. So one of the questions or discussions earlier was making planning material or community ownership material in planning. I think if that happens, developers will have to get involved. It will be part of their business model. They'll work it into their business models. So, material consideration and planning, making it, mandatory. I think they developers, and this may have happened in Scotland, where developers were, I don't know how well it went, but developers were told they had to engage with the community and offer shared ownership. They had to present, the different models. There was support from Local Energy Scotland to help or guide the community through that process. And that's the only way, really, I think that developers will properly engage with communities. And also, as Jake was saying about value, they'll obviously want to sell a share of their wind farm to the community for as much as they can get for it. If they're working with the community at the development stage, then the community deserves to get the benefit of that early stage development. They should get the risk premium that the developers also gaining from that process.
Yeah, that's a good point, isn't it? Rebecca.
So I don't, Jake, on your point of the previous attempt at shared ownership, I don't think it's right to blame that on the fact that it was voluntary, for two reasons. One, that it wasn't exactly voluntary. The proposal was to ask the industry to do it on a voluntary basis, take the experience from that, and if the industry did not comply, to move to mandatory. There was a very, very clear model that was a very clear model that Ed Davey set out. The reason that it didn't work is the 2015 election. So the task force was disbanded, and there was no monitoring, which there was under the original agreement. There was going to be monitoring. The developers would have known that they were being watched. You would have hoped that would have created enough of a sort of pool of experience that we could build on it, and there was always the threat of a stick behind it, and that didn't happen because of the election, and also because of the ban on onshore wind. And onshore wind was always going to be, most of the projects that were going to come under this were going to be onshore wind, and in a way, the reasons for banning onshore wind was the reasons we set up the task force, you know, to develop more constructive relationships around around discussions around onshore wind farms. Having said that, I think that that you need to do more than, you know, a voluntary approach for sure. I really like the idea of a mandatory offer, like developers being obliged to meaningfully offer shared ownership and then seeing what emerges from that, rather than mandating an actual, you know, mandating the actual ownership itself. And I also think that, you know, the split fit is a really good example. Any way that you can give shared ownership projects priority in the you know, in the grid queue, in terms of access to incentives and so on, I think it's absolutely fair and right that that should happen.
Planning too. Planning is critical.
Planning, the material consideration.
Planning, yeah, planning's. I very much agree about the pre-planning phase as well being crucial. I think, I mean, when we did look at this with the task force, there was a lot of issues about it being a material consideration and planning. But, you know, I think I think that it materially changes a planning application anyway if it's going in from a developer together with a community organisation that has a very different feel to it.
Ownership isn't material.
Yeah, I guess, yeah, so there has been some tripping up on that. So I think certainly that the planning is something that we were going to talk about a little bit in our response. Monika.
I just yeah, agree with everything that yeah, everyone before me said. But just what I mean, regardless if it's voluntary or not, and obviously no, it will take a while, but you know, time the government kind of get themselves together. But I would say if you have a project right now you're working on and you are involved in the planning stage in that project, thinking from a yeah, about shared ownership, make sure you do have like a proper exclusivity agreement on this and a proper heads of terms, you know, give you rights. Otherwise, you know, lots of groups can spend a lot of time, it's often a voluntary time as well, and etc. And you know, once projects get planning, then you actually don't have much leverage at that point. So, you know, if you have any projects right now, and also for developers, having, you know, set our heads of terms in that stage, I think really helps. But make it, you know, as legal and exclusivity as kind of you can, and that, you know, that's a good concrete thing to actually things happening.
Great, thanks, Monika. So I'm going to go to the Q&A now. I know there's been lots in the chat, but I'm unable to monitor it all, I'm afraid. So there was a question I noted from the responses as well. There's a question about this sort of local energy supply. So there's been discussions about how communities should be benefiting through their bills. Does that entirely separate to the sort of shared ownership? Where does that local energy supply fit in this conversation, or at all?
I can answer that one a bit.
Yeah.
I mean, this is where 100% community ownership is obviously an advantage, because the community has full control over the contracts. They can sell the power to an energy supplier. If they're behind the meter, they can sell the power directly, which is you know, where you get the best value for selling your electricity. But where you've got a grid connection, or your only option is a grid connection, it's very difficult to sell directly to your local community or your members. There are, you know, we've been asking for this for a long time. The community energy or the community power bill that was going through was looking to do this as well, turn you know, generators into prosumers, or communities into prosumers, so you can produce and receive your power. But so there's various schemes out there that can support you in doing this as a community. One's called Energy Local, where they use a derogation in the off-gem rules that allow communities to purchase power slightly cheaper if it comes from a local generator. But there's this disruptor applications out there now, platforms, like Urban Chain. There's another one called Unify, where they through their platform you can sell power peer to peer, and I really do think that this is a big prize for communities to be able to buy the power that's generated locally. So if the system can somehow make that cheaper for local people, then that's going to be a massive benefit. With shared ownership, these things can be slightly difficult. If it's a split ownership where the community owns the asset and has control over those contracts, yes, it works. But on joint venture, where there are a minority stakeholder, much more difficult. And with a revenue share, you've got no choice at all.
Thanks, Paul. I've seen another question in the Q&A, which I think is a really interesting one, about, we're talking about communities owning something, but is this just the rich people in the communities? How do people actually manage to participate in that? I think, Jake, you've had some thought that you were talking about it, that is potentially an indirect benefit from that, but yeah, you want to respond to that one?
Yeah, we're really clear on this, that community ownership is not about where the money comes from. It's how the asset is owned. It sits in a local not-for-profit company that's set up to serve the local community, and the purpose of it is to generate surplus income and ideally low-cost electricity for that community. And the community investment bit is just a means to that end. If we had the choice between low-cost bank finance and more expensive community investment, we would go for the low-cost bank finance. And community investment is only a local benefit to the extent that the local benefits, the investors are local. It's not to say it's a bad thing. Of course, it's a good thing to democratize investment and have individuals, feeling like they own a stake in a wind farm or a solar farm. But that on its own is not what we're talking about.
Okay, Monika.
It's an interesting time in the market right now because we got used to low interest rate environment, and what you have now is interest rates are the levels that some community groups struggle even raising money, because what they can offer is sort of comparable to what some investors and get from in their deposit account. So this is a challenging time. So I do think that community groups need to be given patience in terms of how quickly they can raise from their own kind of groups. And as Jake says, look at other opportunities with senior debt, and I don't advertise right, but you can also help with those situations. And yeah, I just wanted to also mention two recent projects we did, which one is Ambition Community Energy, and the group owns the asset. It's a part of Bristol. The locals at some point maybe they will be interested in investing, but right now it's not a model. So again, you don't have to have local investment. You can find other sources of capital, and still the community owns it and maximizes the benefits. And the project we've just done in Burnyeat up in near Glasgow, the same situation. A local charity keen to own their own project in the town, and the benefits of that, the revenues that will generate, and the profits that will go into the local causes and local projects they do. So I don't think you always have to have a local investment if that's not possible in your area, and you should, as Jake says, find the most optimal way of financing those projects.
Lovely, thank you, Becky.
Yeah, I don't buy this line that only rich local people get to benefit at all, because it's the point of using if you use community financing mechanisms like a cooperative, particularly a community benefit cooperative, and as someone said in the chat, Co-ops UK have a lot to say about this, that it's almost automatic that the community benefits because the investors get their return, and as Monika says, that's now you now have to compete with bank interest rates, but they get a return on their capital as you would expect from an investment, but they do not expect sort of huge profits, and most investors do that for it's essentially for socially beneficial reasons, and then there is any surplus will be used in the community. So as an example, Burnyeat Community Energy near me in Cumbria, it's not shared ownership exactly, but they've invested in solar panels with the cooperation of a local paper mill, a paper factory in the village. They've basically slathered solar panels all over every warehouse in this factory, and they managed to use the revenue from that to put free solar panels on the school, to the extent that the school doesn't pay for electricity anymore, and they've managed to fund another teaching assistant. So I mean, that's a sort of triple win there. Also the factory gets electricity. So there's I would say it's a very, very rare community stake that doesn't ripple far beyond the community shareholders.
Lovely, thank you. There was a question, I guess, about the size. This was one of the things that we mentioned as well when we were having sort of pre-discussions, like the sort of scale of this. Like, what are we talking about? Massive solar farms? Is there a physical limit to the size that shared ownership can have or be? I think, Jake, you had some initial thoughts about this. What scale are we talking about? What works?
So for context, the community-owned projects we manage, which are 1 to 15 megawatts, 1 to 17 million in capital value, are commensurate with the scale of projects that commercial developers were developing and financing back in 2016-17 when those projects were built. Projects have got bigger because in the subsidy-free world, developers have gone bigger. I don't see any fundamental barrier to communities owning and financing projects at the scale of commercial developers, whatever that scale is, once you start looking at debt-based finance, and it's not just scraping together community investment from the local area. In terms of a mandatory or voluntary shared ownership policy, I think the stake should be significant, 20%, and if a community can't take that up, they don't take it up. But on the other hand, particularly for smaller scale projects, I think a well thought through shared ownership or broader community ownership policy could provide a route for commercial developers to deliver perhaps smaller scale projects that wouldn't be viable under a normal commercial model. So it could drive 100% of smaller scale projects into community ownership, 20%, potentially more for larger scale projects.
And yeah, that's it. I guess there's a question there about the size of the community as well. Like the bigger the project, potentially the larger the area that would have an interest potentially in investing in that. Paul.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the scale, I would say it's very much horses for courses. You've got the 3 different types of model there. With the revenue share, you can go very low. And it still works financially. I think in some of our projects, it was down at 200,000 300,000 or something. And that meant that the majority of investors were local. If you're trying to rate, there is a cap, a natural cap, I would say, on the amount, the size that any community can raise. And that's largely down to the vehicle options you've got to be defined community. They're a charity, it's a co-op, it's a BENCOM, KIC. KIC's slightly complicated because it comes under, if you're raising money through a KIC, you have to hit all the FCA regulations. A cooperative or a BENCOM has the distinct advantage of being able to raise share capital, without having to go through all that complex FCA regulation. But it is limited. For instance, any individual member can only invest up to 100,000. So that's going to put a natural cap. Obviously, you can apply for bank finance or debt from elsewhere, but the way you have to financially structure these projects or these stakes that you buy, so that there is an amount of equity in there. lenders will not lend 100% of the amount you need. You do need a little bit of equity in there. So there is a natural limit on the amount. I mean, 20% of a 100 megawatt wind farm is huge amounts of money, which no community could ever raise. So yeah, I mean, it's great to have these targets or these ambitions, but communities might not necessarily be able to achieve them.
Great, thank you, Paul. Monika.
Yeah, it's interesting. Yeah, I was wondering, Paul, where you would put the limit. I sort of, I've been talking to the conference I'm attending, talking to developers, what they're looking for in terms of share ownership. And interestingly, there's quite a lot of NSIP projects, which are, large, huge solar projects being developed, and they do wonder if a community, how much of community ownership would actually be offered and make some of those projects kind of fundable and in a collaborative way with community groups as well. And I don't have an answer to this, but I was like, that's interesting that, people developing 400 megawatt type of schemes are, now talking about community ownership, because they can see kind of how in a planning process that would make things kind of more collaborative. So I think this is an interesting time for community groups to get some leverage in some of those huge projects. But I don't know it all depends probably on project by project and who you're doing it with, what you can access, who your community group is, and how much expertise you can bring into the process as well. Jake and Paul here, they would have done those projects many times before and can work. If you are a new community group, it'd be difficult probably to find the right expertise. And I saw a question in the Q&A from Mark from Phare around the expertise, and there is models there, and what do communities actually need to do to get those projects do them together.
It seems, I think that's an interesting question again. Like we were mentioning the sort of role of the local authority. Potentially, the larger the project, the more that perhaps the local authority also has a role to, I think mentioned sort of local climate bonds and things like that. Then maybe that starts to move into that area to some extent.
It's a real almost like financing, financial engineering at some stage. And communities have not been doing that up to now. So
Karina, you went off camera, but did you have?
Yeah, so I just picked up a couple from the chat, which was an interesting one commenter, I can't remember who it was, sorry, said that standardized models, including valuations and low cost finance, are critical. So I guess the question on that is, where are we with that in terms of, do we have standardized models, and how are we on that at the moment? And then another question kind of linking to that is, could the panel help this? Is there a quantification of the social return of investment on shared ownership at the moment? Is there a model to do that? Because this is the language commercial organisations might understand better. So if anyone has any thoughts on those.
I know from the work I did in Bristol, where the local authority there went into partnership with a commercial developer to transition the city. So we're talking about a massive scheme there. You'll have to give me, I've forgotten the name. There's an acronym of some sort of scheme, smart something. But it's a social value metric that can be applied to the projects, and if you meet these standards, then you can be said to be delivering social value on your project. I know that was a big part of the City Leap project. That's so I can remember on that. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. Anyone else want to jump in on that? Monika, you've still got your hand up. Is that a legacy hand or a new hand?
Tom, someone's just said Tom.
Sorry, you're on mute. Sorry.
It was a legacy hand, but then I decided actually I'm going to keep it up because I think it depends what you're trying to do. If you're trying to do, Paul there outlined the types of shared ownership, and some of those, like joint venture, is a thing that's been done, thousands of times before, but not between communities. But it's investors do it all the time with themselves. So it kind of almost coming into structure that has been done before. It's just not for community groups. But I think it's easy to adapt. Some other things like shared revenue, that's probably more new model. I don't think there's been that many of those. I think that the example of feeder road we have done is probably like that. And then split ownership, the feed-in tariff, Jake's brilliant example, the 5+5. That was it's perfect. That's a model there, and again, it could be reactivated for split ownership. So it depends on what you do. There's some basis you can start from, and I see that Mark says that heads of terms will be also available from summer, from the work that Local Energy Scotland is doing. So there's definitely some things emerging in the market, and how to do it, I think.
Lovely. Jake.
In terms of standardized models, I think in terms of shared ownership models on the transaction side and legal documents and things, they can be helpful, but the more important thing is to have an overarching policy framework which is really clear and everyone's working within. And a key element of that is a price setting mechanism, so that the price parameters in which developers and communities are working in are fixed by that policy, and then that leaves developers and communities to innovate with financial engineering, if you want to call that, structuring, etc.
Lovely. Rebecca.
Well, I just wanted to heartily agree with that, really. I mean, to a certain extent, we're running ahead of ourselves here by sort of trying to work through all the technicalities of all the different ways that, shared ownership could happen this time round. It's a bit like, I think this to a certain extent with the sort of with debates about training and skills more generally for net zero. Obviously you need to think about the practicalities, but at the same time, if you have some more generalized headline policies, if your policies very strongly say that shared ownership is expected, and that there will be certain incentives and advantages to doing shared ownership, you can pretty much guarantee that people will find a way to do it. Similarly, we saw this is why the skills and training point is relevant, that we saw the massive uptick in small traders learning how to install solar panels as a result of the FIT, and then unfortunately that them seeing an absolute seesawing of their business afterwards as FITs came and went and solar prices sort of went up and then down again and so on. But the fact is that if you set expectations clearly and confidently and you stick with it, then people find a way of doing it. That's massively the history of policy and governance.
Lovely. Monika, I just wanted to also talk a little bit about I guess the sort of the relationship between a community, and I know we're sort of talking about models and having the right terms and policies and stuff, but that's sort of how you've got very commercial organizations working with volunteers. Like, how does that trust develop? Has that been an issue, or do we think this is something that we can that just even like you said, Becky, about if we establish this as a need, then those sort of relationships and that trust will build over time? Have we had problems, Paul and Jake, with trying to negotiate too?
I think it's finding like-minded organizations with shared values that it kind of goes back to that, and ideally it's not just that people want this because then it's easier in planning. if it's done for the right reasons, and people getting together to that just is something brings you back to, because those negotiations are difficult and have to be in a way, because in negotiating very typically commercial terms as well. And but I think going back to so choosing working with parties that have shared goals and those kind of values is really important. And in terms of the wish list, things we try, I think if there's more than just planning advantages, if there's other things that communities can bring to the table, I don't know, like access to maybe PPAs with local authorities, or some tax incentives if there were, or reduction in business rates, if there is kind of more commercial reasons for developers to do it, that would be ideal. And time is now to kind of ask for what those things would be that communities can bring to the table.
Great, thank you. Paul.
Yeah, talking about trusted partners and shared ownership, and templates or models, if you like. Let's not forget there's a really good relationship model between local authorities and the community. There's really good examples of solar roof projects on schools, on community centres. Edinburgh Solar has got a relationship with City of Edinburgh Council, where they're putting, I think they're in their third phase now, where they're putting solar panels on as many public buildings as they can in the city. North Links has got a grant from the government, and they put together a similar scheme. Bath and West is doing it. We're being contacted by quite a lot of local authorities, and you've got a great relationship there. Where the local authority has the assets, the community's got the capacity and the finance to deliver it, and the local authority gets fixed or cheap power, and the local community get all the benefit from it. So let's not forget, shared ownership can go in more than one direction.
Yeah, so we've got a few minutes left, and I wanted I think we had a quick question to the panelists about the one thing that they would want to put in this response, or want as a policy. So I'm going to go around the panel to conclude and ask you for your sort of, reflections and your wish list, one or a few things that would be on your wish list for what you would like the new administration to do, perhaps maybe even in its first 100 days. Let's hope. Becky, on this topic, I guess, not just on looking offshore wind.
Oh, not everything. I was going to do the whole list.
So many options.
I would say that they should signal clearly that they're going to mandate offering shared ownership to communities within a certain time frame, set that out really clearly, decide how they will incentivize that, and basically make it really hard, make it possible but really hard for developers not to do that with a project over a certain size, and particularly attached to the lifting of the de facto onshore wind ban. That's the moment to come back and say, of course we want onshore wind, you love it, it's popular, and this is how we're going to do it. Not but, and this is how we're going to do it. We're going to make sure it works for local people. So I mean, what's the downside to that?
Sounds great. I'd vote for that. Paul.
Yeah, I was going to say dismantle the entire money system, or banning a charging an interest, but that would put Monika out of a job. So I suppose in terms of shared ownership or community energy in general, I think it has to be down to some sort of mandatory material planning legislation change. I think that would be great, and some sort of support mechanism for communities financially, because small scale, communities naturally want to do small scale. We can't do these giant mega projects, and they need to be giant these days in order to work financially. So some sort of support mechanism, be that grant or some sort of revenue scheme. But yeah, those two things, I think.
Lovely. Jake. the others have been taken,
I
unfortunately.
think the government needs a very clear, positive vision of what they're trying to get out of this, i.e., the local energy, the well-resourced local energy enterprise, and I think that needs to be the motivation, rather than seeing shared ownership as a means of getting communities that would otherwise be opposed to support a project. Because I'm not sure that premise has worked in some cases. It's not going to work in all cases. It certainly doesn't work where a developer's been working on a 400 megawatt solar farm, for example, finds the community embedded against it, and introduces the idea of shared ownership late in the day as a means of sweetening the pill. That isn't going to work, and that it shouldn't be what it's about. So it needs to be positive vision, and they need to create a set of policies which provide positive reasons for both sides to engage in it. But I have got the final thought on the planning point, and I know there's been appeals which have determined that community benefit and ownership are not material in planning. On the other hand, there are planning cases where projects have gone through planning because they are community owned, or the option, or the community has the option for owning it, where they wouldn't have done otherwise. And not giving community ownership or community purpose weight in planning just seems really odd to me, because a village hall or a scout hut or a football club shed probably wouldn't get planning in many cases if you're just thinking of it as an abstract building in the landscape. It has a community purpose, and that is surely is and should be a significant factor in the planning decision, and the same should go for a genuine community-owned renewable energy project.
Yeah. Thanks, Jake and Monica.
Yeah, all those points.
Sorry, go live.
The sort of, up to 10 megawatts scale is really challenging. We need mechanism, something like CFD or maybe more clear way for local authorities to sign PPAs with those small projects, just so they've got a route to market. Because there's so many stuck projects in the system right now. The sort of the planning, I would also add grid to it. So why, if community projects are in those kind of why not be also fast track on the grid side? Again, that creating those more, therefore creating more incentives for developers wanting to do this would be really important. So and I think it's really important that we as a sector really give good answers on this, so the next government can take this and kind of work with something forward.
Thank you, Monica. That is the plan, and I found that a really fascinating discussion, and thank you so much to our panelists for contributing. Like I said, I'm really optimistic that we can hit them with some really great big ideas for the sector, and then advocate for those in our new administration. So yeah, just thank you everyone for joining, participating, and we will be uploading everything and sharing everything as soon as we can.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
So,
Bye.